In 1965, a 25-year-old factory worker named John Thompson clocked into his shift at the British Motor Corporation plant in Oxford at 7 o'clock in the morning. He assembled car engines for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, earning £17 and 10 shillings per week. This might not sound like much, but adjusted for inflation, John earned the equivalent of £32,000 per year in today's money. With that single income, he supported a wife and 2 children, paid rent on a 3-bedroom terraced house that cost £12 per month, and still had enough money left over to save for a deposit on his own home. Within 3 years, John bought that house for £4,000, roughly 3 times his annual salary. He owned a car, took his family on holiday to Blackpool every summer, and retired at 60 with a full company pension that paid 70% of his final salary for the rest of his life. This was not unusual. This was normal. In post-war Britain, a single full-time income could comfortably support an entire family, provide housing security, and build genuine wealth over a working lifetime. The social contract was simple and clear. If you worked hard and showed up every day, society guaranteed you a decent standard of living, a path to homeownership, and a secure retirement. Fast forward 60 years to 2025, and that contract has been completely shattered. Today, Sarah Mitchell works full-time as a teaching assistant in Manchester, earning £24,000 per year. She works 37.5 hours per week, exactly the same as John Thompson did in 1965, but her financial reality is incomprehensibly worse. Sarah's rent for a 1-bedroom flat consumes £14,000 of her annual income, leaving her with less than £10,000 for everything else: food, transportation, utilities, clothing, and any attempt at savings. She cannot afford a car, she has never been on holiday abroad. The idea of buying a house is so far beyond her reach that she has stopped even looking at property websites because the fantasy is too painful. A modest 2-bedroom terraced house in her area costs £250,000, more than 10 times her annual salary. To get a mortgage, she would need a deposit of £25,000, an amount she could never save while paying rent that increases every year. Sarah is not lazy. She is not uneducated. She is not making poor choices. She works full-time in a job that society considers essential. She has a university degree that cost her £40,000 in student loans. She does not waste money on luxuries. She shops at budget supermarkets, rarely eats out, and has not bought new clothes in over a year. Yet despite doing everything society told her to do, despite working full-time and living frugally, Sarah is poor. She lives paycheck to paycheck with no savings, no assets, and no realistic prospect of ever improving her situation. This is not just Sarah's story. This is the story of millions of British workers who have discovered a devastating truth. In modern Britain, having a full-time job no longer guarantees financial security. According to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, there are now over 4 million people in Britain living in in-work poverty, meaning they work full-time but still cannot afford a basic standard of living. This number has increased by 60% in the last decade. These are not unemployed people relying on benefits. These are nurses, teachers, retail workers, hospitality staff, care workers, delivery drivers, warehouse employees, and administrative assistants. These are people who wake up every morning, go to work, contribute to the economy, and yet remain trapped in poverty despite their efforts. The question that haunts modern Britain is simple but profound. What happened? How did we go from a society where a factory worker could support a family and buy a house to a society where university graduates working full-time cannot even afford to rent a decent flat? The answer is not a single policy failure or economic shock. The answer is a systematic dismantling of the economic structures that once translated work into prosperity, a dismantling that has taken place over 4 decades and has now reached a critical point where the majority of British workers will never achieve the standard of living their parents considered normal. To understand how Britain created millions of working poor people, we need to examine the economic transformation that began in the 1980 seconds and accelerated through successive governments of both parties, a transformation that prioritized corporate profits and asset prices over wages and worker security, a transformation that turned housing from a human right into a speculative investment, a transformation that shifted the entire economy from productive industry to low-wage service jobs. The story of Britain's working poor begins with a simple fact that politicians desperately want you to ignore. Wages have been disconnected from productivity for 40 years. Between 1950 and 1980, when British workers became more productive, they were paid more. This seems obvious and fair. If a company makes more profit because workers produce more output, those workers should share in that profit through higher wages. This is how capitalism is supposed to work. But since 1980, something extraordinary and sinister happened. Worker productivity continued to rise, meaning British workers produced more goods and services per hour than ever before, but wages flatlined. The extra profit generated by this increased productivity did not go to workers. it went to shareholders and executives. If wages had continued to track productivity as they did before 1980, the average British worker today would earn approximately £45,000 per year, instead of the actual median wage of £31,000. That £14,000 gap, multiplied across millions of workers, represents the largest wealth transfer from labor to capital in British history. This wage suppression was not an accident or a natural market outcome. It was a deliberate policy choice driven by several interconnected factors. First, the destruction of trade unions eliminated workers' collective bargaining power. In 1979, over 50% of British workers belonged to unions that could negotiate for higher wages. Today, that figure has fallen to 23%. And in the private sector, where most people work, union membership is below 15%. Without unions, individual workers have no leverage to demand pay increases. They must accept whatever wage their employer offers or face unemployment. Second, globalization allowed British companies to threaten workers with offshoring. Manufacturing jobs that once paid middle-class wages were moved to China, India, and Eastern Europe, where labor was cheaper. This not only eliminated millions of good jobs, but also created downward pressure on wages for jobs that remained. Workers who asked for raises were told the company would move operations abroad if labor costs increased. Third, immigration policy was deliberately used to suppress wages in certain sectors. This is not an argument against immigration as a moral principle, but a statement of economic fact. When you rapidly increase the supply of workers in specific industries without increasing demand for those workers, wages fall. Successive governments expanded immigration specifically to keep wages low in hospitality, agriculture, care work, and construction. Employers benefited from cheap labor while workers saw their wages stagnate or decline. Fourth, the shift from permanent employment to precarious work destroyed job security and wage growth. Zero-hour contracts, temporary positions, agency work, false self-employment, and gig economy jobs now represent a massive portion of the British labor market. Workers in these arrangements have no guaranteed hours, no sick pay, no holiday pay, no pension contributions, and no ability to plan their finances. They also have no negotiating power because they can be dismissed instantly without cause. Even workers in permanent positions face wage suppression because employers know that credible threats of switching to precarious contracts keep workers from demanding more. Fifth, the cost of living has exploded while wages stagnated, creating a scissors effect that has gutted workers' purchasing power. Housing costs are the most obvious example. In 1980, the average British house cost 3.5 times the average salary. Today, that ratio is 8 times, and in London and the southeast, it exceeds 12 times. Rent has increased even faster than house prices in many areas. A worker in 1980 might spend 20% of their income on housing. A worker today spends 40 to 50% or more. This is not because modern workers are wasteful or choose expensive housing. This is because housing costs have been deliberately inflated by government policies that treat property as an investment vehicle rather than a human necessity. But housing is just one piece. Transportation costs have soared, with Britain having the most expensive rail fares in Europe. Childcare costs average over £1,200 per month for full-time care, more than many workers earn. Energy bills have tripled since 2021. Food inflation has run rampant. Council taxes continue to rise. The cumulative effect is that even workers earning above minimum wage find themselves unable to meet basic costs. Sixth, the tax and benefit system has been restructured to extract more from workers while giving less back. National insurance contributions have increased. Income tax thresholds have been frozen, dragging more workers into higher brackets through fiscal drag. VAT has risen from 15% to 20%. Meanwhile, in-work benefits that once topped up low wages have been cut repeatedly. Universal credit provides far less support than the legacy benefits it replaced. The result is that workers keep less of what they earn and receive less help when they struggle. Seventh, and perhaps most perversely, the British economy has been restructured away from industries that pay well toward industries that pay poorly. Manufacturing, which once employed millions in middle-class jobs, has collapsed from employing 32% of workers in 1978 to less than 8% today. These jobs have been replaced primarily by service sector work in retail, hospitality, care, and logistics. Sectors characterized by low wages, minimal benefits, and limited career progression. A car factory worker in 1980 earned enough to support a family. A warehouse worker or care home assistant today does not, even though both jobs require similar skill levels and work intensity. The fundamental economic model of Britain has shifted from making things to serving the people who own things. The wealthy need workers to staff their restaurants, deliver their packages, care for their elderly parents, and clean their homes, but they do not want to pay these workers enough to live with dignity. This is the reality of modern Britain, a low-wage service economy where profits flow upward while workers sink into poverty despite full-time employment. The political class responds to this crisis with insulting suggestions. Workers should get more skills, work harder, budget better, or move to cheaper areas. But this advice is both cruel and mathematically impossible. Not everyone can be a software engineer or investment banker. Society needs care workers, teachers, shop assistants, and cleaners. These jobs are essential and must be done by someone. If those jobs do not pay enough to live on, then society is admitting that it requires millions of people to work full-time in poverty so that others can live comfortably. This is not a sustainable economic model. It is a moral obscenity. Britain has created an economy where work no longer provides security, where effort no longer guarantees dignity, and where an entire generation will be poorer than their parents despite being better educated and working longer hours. The social contract that John Thompson lived under in 1965 is dead. Sarah Mitchell will never own a home, never retire comfortably, and never escape the paycheck-to-paycheck existence that defines life for Britain's working poor. This is not inevitable. This is a choice made by politicians who prioritize property values over worker wages, corporate profits over human dignity, and short-term electoral advantage over long-term social stability.